Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me first introduce the facilitator of today's panel. It is Madam Fazia Sani. She is with Singapore Customs. And the way we're going to do this is I call up our panelists, if you'll just come up and have a seat. And then I'm not going to give a big introduction on each one of them. I'm going to let them do that because I want you to hear from them who they are and why they're sitting up here on stage under these spotlights. And the air con's turned down a little bit because for those people that don't do things like this, it gets really hot up here. So first of all, Madam Fazia, let's go ahead and bring you up to the stage. She will be the facilitator. And so when she's going to walk the panel through everything, and then we'll have you guys ask questions. So Dr. Christian Isla, he is from Germany's BAFA, the licensing agency. Mr. Rick Leichhardt, he is the customs attaché from the Netherlands here in Singapore. Katsaru Igari, the director from the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry here in Japan. Mr. Alexander Lopes from the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security. I'm butchering my own organization's name. And then if I could have Ms. Eliza and Ms. Janice also both come back up to the stage. We'll go ahead and go. Eliza? Okay. Where'd Miss Janice go? I think she's here somewhere. Okay. While we're waiting on Janice to come, we'll... So I have been handed a small bit of trinketness for the first question during the Q&A phase. So there is a prize if you ask a question directed towards one of our panelists. So it was funny, a couple years ago before we got started on this, we were talking about end-use checks from the BIS point of view, and I said, generally speaking, if you're in this room, you know, the first question gets an end-use check, and the funny thing is one came in the next day for that company that asked the first question. So that's not the prize for this year's event. So I'm going to go ahead and turn everything over to Madam Fazia. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Thanks, Scott. I think good morning, everybody. We are privileged here to have our speakers to be presenting on their respective export control laws before we start our panel discussions. May I invite the first speaker, Christian Essel from BAFA, Germany, to give his presentation first. Thank you.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Ms. Sani, for this kind of introduction. Before I start, I would like to just shortly introduce myself. As you heard, my name is Christian Eisele. I'm from the German Federal Office of Economic Affairs and Export Control. It's easier to say BAFA, but don't get your head mixed around how that BAFA connects with this federal office. If you know German, it makes sense. I'm a technical expert at BAFA. I have an engineering background, and I work for the technical division. We do a lot of risk assessment and rating of items, and in my day-to-day business, I do the regime work, usually Wassenaar and NSG for mostly Category 2 items. Before I start, I also would like to express my thank you for this invitation here. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning to this joint industry outreach seminar, and to speak about a new German approach in rating of items of goods that have an upgrade potentials, usually unlocked via license keys. I picked this topic because I think it's a quite interesting example of how a licensing authority always tries to maintain the balance between security and competitiveness, and what steps are needed to go through that. Can I have the, yeah. All right. Before I start with the new approach, I want to show you how we approached goods with an upgrade potential before that. In order to determine whether you need a license for an item or not, we always evaluate the technical characteristics of the item at the moment of export. The difference between now and then is that we look at the full technical potentials that an item might have. That means for a license requirement, it did not matter to us if your good has any log performance or potentials or not. So these log potentials were basically regarded as fully usable potentials. So looking at that approach from the perspective of balancing security and competitiveness, we ask ourselves, is this approach still corresponds to the economic reality or not? What we have found is that upgrades of products become more and more standard these days because of new business models that companies implement. Basically, the upgrade of functions is nothing new and is very common if you upgrade the firmware of a product. There are several examples for this, and I'm pretty sure that you yourself have some experiences with an upgrade of a product via a new firmware. For example, I personally know that from my camera, where the functionality to do post-processing of the picture already on the camera was unlocked via a software update. But I have to say that the examples that we know are very much limited to IT products or consumer electronics. It has not been common for other industry products until now. We think this is changing because more and more products are digitalized and networked with other items. One example is that you see here, I want to show you that it's not IT on consumer electronics, it's a car from Tesla. As you might know, Tesla produces all electric cars equipped with a battery. And in order to offer a more competitive starting price for their customers, Tesla limits the battery capacity on some models via software. And you can upgrade for a higher capacity later on if you're a paying customer. That this works was proven during the evacuation from the Hurricane Irma in Florida, where Tesla temporarily removed this restriction by software via an upgrade from the distance, so that people were safer to get away from the danger area. From a very basic technical perspective, how does an update work and what is the typical process of an item activation? So first, as a starting point, you have your initial item with all technical functions accessible or unlocked. Then these functions will be limited, usually to create customers' willingness to pay at a later stage. So what you end up with is an item that can be used for certain tasks, whereas not all functions are accessible. This process can be reversed, and the block functions can be activated so that you end up with your initial item. So you're basically back at your starting point. In the last few years, the technical experts at the German licensing office have been discussed intensively on how the question of how items should be technically evaluated if they have functions which lead to a license requirement, but those functions are blocked at the moment of export. So the first thing we usually do is look at the control list. Then we find overall 4 list entries that specifically aim at controlling the upgrade of functions of controlled items. These list entries can be found in category 3 for frequency changes or generators, in category 7 for navigational systems, but also in the munitions list aiming at military functions. So what you see is that all list entries that deal with upgrades are either controlled as software or as technology. The problem is that these list entries only aim at very specific products and cannot be generally used for other items. In order to regard items with locked performance potentials as not controlled, we need a way to somehow control the update at a later stage and bring this in line with the control list. Otherwise, no effective export control would be possible because both the original item with the block functions and the subsequent activation would not be covered by the control list. So in order to solve this problem, we found several possible approaches for rating the upgrade. The easiest way would be if we have upgrades for the items that I just showed you on the slide before. So in this case, we would just use the control list entries that already exist. We think the best alternative to that is to rate upgrades or license keys as software or technology for the use of items, provided that we have the corresponding control list entries. If these two approaches do not work, it also might be possible to regard upgrades as equipment, modules, or components in certain cases. As you can see, a variation of the rating of the unlocking element is very much determined by its technical realization and must be handled on a case-by-case basis. As explained on the last slide, we basically established a way of regarding an item with locked functions as not controlled. But what would we need for that as a licensing authority during the technical assessment and the licensing process? So first of all, we would need a strong lock and release concept from the applying company, which contains all technical details. This should include, for example, how the effective lock of function is implemented, where the servers for the management of license keys are located, etc. Companies also should allow for physical inspections of locked good from a technical expert from BAFA if regarded as necessary. A very important point for us is how the lock of the function is realized. Companies need to clarify what kind of cryptographic algorithm they used, and we would not accept any algorithms which might not be recommendable or are not state-of-the-art anymore. And last but not least, especially from a customs enforcement perspective, it is very important that companies separate their locked and released goods with meaningful and distinguishable type designations. All involved parties and authorities must be able to clearly identify the separate type of items. In the end, the process must be manageable and transparent for all involved parties. From a perspective of balancing security and competitiveness, it is beneficial in this case that the interests of export control authorities and companies overlap. They are both interested in an effective way of locking the functions, although for different reasons. The authorities due to a potential misuse of the functions, whereas the companies only want paying customers to have access to block functions. I want to end my presentation with a short case study, which is based on a real case we encountered at the end of last year. The company that approached us is a manufacturer of mass spectrometers. Those spectrometers measure the masses within a provided sample and are used in many applications, especially in the food and medical sector. You need those instruments in order to determine the characteristics of a sample or molecule, for example, its chemical composition or structure. The mass spectrometer the company asked us about is controlled by the NSG under 3A233A due to its measurement principle and resolution. So what the company did is was downgrading the resolution of the spectrometer via software. Therefore, the performance parameters according to the 3A233A would not be met anymore, and the spectrometer could be regarded as not controlled. The company offers the activation of the higher resolution as an upgrade, which is realized via a device-specific license key. In case of an export, we would control this license key as use technology according to 3E201. This brings me to the end of my presentation. In case you have any specific questions, you can ask me now on stage, or approach me also during coffee break. I will be around the whole day. But you can always drop me also an email or give me a phone call. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Christian. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions later. May I now invite Rick Legaard from the Embassy of Kingdom of the Netherlands, our customs attaché here. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. While the colleagues are setting up my presentation, let me introduce myself a bit. I work here in Singapore, representing my customs administration. I am with the customs administration for over 37 years now, working in all different varieties of the beautiful work of customs, including this part of the work. Staying in life for 37 years also makes, hopefully, underlines that I do not only work in this area, because just wanted to express that I'm not a specialist on this. I cover the full range of customs-related work. So, as you can see from the previous presentation, which was much more detailed and much more specialized, please do not expect that from me. Actually, leading up to this meeting, this seminar, Christian and I were in contact because I was a little bit afraid that we would overlap representing the European Union here on stage. But after we shared our presentations, it would pretty soon came clear that we would not overlap at all. I will enlighten you a little bit on the EU legislation and a bit on the national legislation of the Netherlands, which is still and will remain a member state of the EU. And especially in light of the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, which was recently signed and is now in its ratification progress, this might be of interest for you because it opens up maybe new markets for you and your companies. As mentioned, I'm a representative of the Customs Administration of the Netherlands, and that means that together with a couple of colleagues posted around the world, we try to cooperate with the local customs authorities and other enforcement agencies. And as you can see from the slide, we try to spread out over the world, but we are only limited in resources and human as well as financial resources. So we have 4 customs attachés in Brazil, China, Moscow, and in Singapore. And we have a representative within the EU in Brussels that discusses all the EU legislation and regulations. And a colleague of mine in the US, in Washington, D.C., who is posted there on behalf of the Ministry of Finance, and he also covers customs as well. What we try to do is to reach out to economic areas that are of importance for the Netherlands, economically looking at the economic cooperation. And we try to reach out not only to the government agencies, but especially also to the business to introduce ourselves, to explain legislation and regulation, but also be open to receive questions and lead you to the right agencies in my country. As mentioned, I'm based here in Singapore now for just over 4 years. My embassy is just across the street. Don't look for a nice big building like the Thai embassy or the US embassy. We are very quietly hidden away in an office apartment in Lia Towers. But I'm always happy to receive you there if necessary. For me, the ASEAN region is my focal area. I am officially accredited in 5 countries: Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. But well, living in this area and being in touch with so many people working in the region, I'm also every now and then approached by companies or customs administrations from the other 5 ASEAN countries. Well, as mentioned, the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, I thought, well, let's take this opportunity to also introduce a little bit about the EU and its differences compared to the ASEAN Economic Community. The EU is an internal market, and if you will see during my presentation, that means that we do not have borders anymore among our 28 member states. It also means that a lot of the legislation that we as member states use is used in the other member states as well. And I can't leave out the opportunity to express my concerns and that of my administration once we hit March 29, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, depending on which timeline you look at. In Singapore, it will already be March 30, 6 a.m. when our beloved neighbors, the United Kingdom, will leave our union. It will give a lot of extra work. It's a big burden for customs administrations in the EU. And to give you an idea about the effect of all of a sudden introducing a border between countries, which you know so well here in ASEAN, if you cross a border, there is customs. In the EU, many of your colleagues working in business do not remember at all what a customs border was or is or will be. The Netherlands has 35,000 to 38,000 companies that now trade with the UK just using one invoice, traveling across the channel, and that's all the customs or the border-related issues they encounter until March 30. Then all of a sudden they need an export declaration, they need an import declaration, they need all kind of other certificates, etc. So we are really, well, looking forward, to put it mildly, to the extra work that it will put on our plate. The other 27 will remain a customs union, will remain a an internal market, which for you means if you trade with one of the other 27 member states, you just follow EU legislation, which sounds very easy. Most of the time it is. And this morning during coffee, I was approached by someone asking, well, if I buy my stuff in my product in Germany, and I bring it across the border, do I have to follow multiple control lists? Well, it's very easy. If you bring it directly from Germany outside of Germany by air, you only follow one control list, the EU control list. But if you would have to bring it, for example, to the port of Rotterdam, then there might be a chance that you also have to follow a national military control list. I'll get back to you later on that. I hope the difference between EU and ASEAN is clear. Now, let me see if the technique works. Because, as mentioned, I have a general knowledge on this topic. So I asked my colleagues to send me over some information, and they came up with this brilliant idea. Rick, we have a video for you explaining everything. So if you, let's see if it works. It's approximately 4 minutes, and it should be in English. Let's hope we have sound. We do.
International security, a shared responsibility for all of us. For security abroad directly impacts our national security. That is why government and business control the export of strategic goods. What exactly are strategic goods? Among others, strategic goods are dual-use goods, industrial products and technology for civilians as well as military purposes. Also military goods such as spare parts for fighter planes. For export and in certain cases for transit, a permit is required. The responsibility for the policy in this field lies with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Customs contribute by means of export control, but business and industry are also expected to deliver an important contribution. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs makes international agreements, also on export control. In collaboration with other countries, we decide which goods and technology need to be controlled. For this purpose, the European Union employs 2 lists, one for military and one for dual-use goods and technology. The agreements we make together in the EU are included in Dutch legislation. Anybody involved in the export and transit of strategic goods has to apply for a permit from the Central Import and Export Office, the CDIU, well in advance. The CDIU is part of customs and is located in Groningen. Granting a permit is done on a case-by-case risk assessment basis, involving the exporter, the goods, the final use, and the end user. When a company prepares to export goods, it files an export declaration with customs. Customs assesses this declaration, and if strategic goods are involved, they check if the correct export permit has been granted. Should this not be the case, the goods are physically checked. A specially trained customs officer looks into the goods, the export permit, and the documents that go with it. If the customs officer concludes that strategic goods are involved and the correct started is lacking, the CDIU is contacted. The CDIU receives the results of the physical check and may then decide to hold up the goods for closer investigation. The team precursor strategic goods and sanctioned legislation, in other words, Team POS, is then requested to take over the investigation. Team POS is also responsible for supervising compliance with the regulations concerning strategic goods. Besides investigating held up goods, this team periodically executes investigations that monitor the administration of companies. Team POS also investigates when there is a criminal offense. If a criminal offense is ascertained, Team POS informs the public prosecutor. During investigations, Team POS also provides information on laws and regulations. Additionally, the industry is expected to conduct its business in a socially responsible manner. This way, the government and businesses are responsible for our security together.
I couldn't have said it better than my colleagues in this video. This shows that in the Netherlands, customs has a large role to play when it comes to licensing, investigation and enforcement, but it's still Ministry of Foreign Affairs that is responsible. There we go. I'm pretty sure all of you in the room are aware of all these different arrangements that are in place, and I just want to emphasize with this slide that it is a political decision for every country whether or not to be part of a certain agreement. If, for example, in the EU, most member states are either individual member of an arrangement. In some cases, the EU is a member, and if I understand correctly, only Cyprus is not part of most of them. I think this is mentioned before already today, but this is what the EU has introduced as a tool to well, understand what we are talking about when we are trading with each other and we have goods that are shipped all over the world. And I'm actually happy that the EU at least brought their knowledge and their lists around the world, because I understand now Malaysia, Japan, the US and many other countries are using this list. And as you can see, already mentioned, there's an EU dual use control list and the common military list. And especially for the military list, there might be a chance that there is individual legislation from the individual member states, where the dual use control list is EU legislation that is directly applicable on the EU member states. Well, for those of you who work with this, you know how the list is used, the technical categories. Once you have found your listing in that part of the list, you go to the product groups, and finally you will find the code relating to the arrangement, and that's, well, pretty much speaks for itself, I think. Also, this is already mentioned. If we talk about control goods, we do not only talk about physical goods, we also mean technology, information and services. So be aware that if you are providing a service to a different a country, you can also be you also need to check whether that service is on the controlled items list. It's always a difficult balance between enforcing and installing legislation and also facilitating trade. If too many items would be on the control list, then it would be very difficult for you as a business to do what you are aiming for, is do business. As regulatory agents, we try to do our best to keep things in balance. Well, being asked to also give you a little bit of update on future developments. The EU will soon, and it's already December, so assuming it will be done before Christmas, within the next 2 or 3 weeks, you will see the new updated EU dual-use common list. Once it is translated and all technical barriers are taken, then it will also be used in Malaysia and other countries. And currently there is a discussion on modernizing the EU dual-use regulation, and it is expected to be released in 2019, but I put a question mark behind that because there's a lot of discussion going on in that. And why is there a lot of discussion? I think we also saw that in the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. The EU put a lot of emphasis on human rights, terrorism-related articles. So the member states are still discussing among each other how to implement that in the new regulation. I'm open for questions later on. But if you might not catch me during the day, please send me an email or call me on my Singapore handphone, and I'm happy to take your questions whenever, during the day or later on during the week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry to explain here again. And then, I'm now my name is Igari, and I'm now in charge of some industry outreach and outreach to academia, and also enforcement issues in MITI. So now at I'm now that I would briefly explain that the Japanese experience of the relation and the cooperation with the industry. So, before I start, I would like to emphasize that the importance of cooperation between government and industry is getting more and more critical or crucial because of the advance of technology and the innovation, and also internet, and so the items such as semiconductor or some robotics or some the drones or the computer, or these item is widely used for some explosive development, explosive equipment, or some military technology sometimes, or some chemical weapons. So because of such kind of advancement of technology and the innovations, our cooperation is much more important. I just briefly explain that our export control system, we have a foreign exchange trade and a foreign exchange and the Foreign Trade Act is a basic law framework of our export control. And under this law, we have some cabinet order or some ministerial order which specifies the control list and also the specification of some each goods and technology. In the last year, we have amended our export control systems in order to strengthen some enforcement activities such as penalties or some administrative sanctions. And also we also we also make the addition of some condition. That means that if the company that violates some re-export conditions, if, for example, Japanese exporter which food that violates the export condition, which was added by MITI, and if such things, if violation happen, then this the exporter should be punished or some penalized. That's some addition of our new regulation. And also that other some the regulation or amendment is just avoid any loophole of our administrative sanctions, or some extend some administrative sanctions, or some expand for example, that the brokers who was involved in some violation, we can also capture these brokers for under our Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Act. These are some of our the activities of strengthening our current control. We also now in the process of the reorganizing, restructuring our control list. Actually, our control list is different from the international control list. That means as EU control list or some control list applying it in some Asian countries. So, but actually that we have received comments from Singapore industry 2 years ago in this industry outreach. We are claimed or complained by some Singapore companies that why Japan is implementing some unique control list. That makes some confusion. So that's why we try to amend our control list, which is now try to make it in accordance with some international control list or some EU control list. That's some of our activities too to relax or that make it easy for to a better understanding of our export control systems. In case of Japan, we have some history of some export control, and then in particular export control violation. Around 30 years ago, there's a big export control violation made by very famous Japanese machinery industry. And this company illegally exported machine tools to some countries. And this countries is item was this machine tool was actually used for the enhancement of capacity of submarine. For example, the high performance machine tools can makes very detailed assembly of some screw or some propellant of some submarine. So this is that kind of incident was become that very big some political or some economical problem between Japan and the Western countries. And then this very famous machine tool company was actually was criticized by the public and the media, by our stakeholders or shareholders or some other foreign business partners. So that the violation of export control is not only punished or penalized by some government or some Japanese court, but also lose some international credibility, and then lose their some business, and also such kind of some big impact happens in Japan 30 years ago. And after this event, after this incident, Japanese government and also Japanese industry actually worked together to strengthen the export control system. And the Japanese industry actually create their own association that called SISTEC. And then they try to expand their compliance activities through to the Japanese industries. And also that the government also promoted some ICP, and and also government provided some the benefits such as bulk licenses or some other simplified licensing procedure for ICP holders or some the good company. So such kind of some cooperation between government and the industry, then both party can have a benefit, for that the industry can enjoy some relaxed licensing procedure by using this ICP, by using bulk licenses, and the government can also rely certain export controls the implementation to some private sectors. But also I will make I will touch upon later a little bit, but we also conduct very strict inspection to each ICP holders. And if we can find some that violation of some ICP or some violation law, and then this company will be some that permit will be revoked, or some that they will lose some benefit. So we have a cooperation, but we also keep certain distance or certain tension among us. But overall, we are trying to work together for the common goals or the common directions. And also we also have some frequently discuss with the industry, and if we have some mistakes, or if there are some not useless, but if there are some burden for industry, so we can reconsider some license exemption, or some application of bulk licenses. And then, so such kind of daily conversation with industry, by using such kind of opportunity, we can strengthen our overall export control application. That's our basic idea. And then with regard to some ICP, it was also, these elements of ICP is almost same as some other Asian partners, or some European or some American regulations. But the important thing is that they designate certain person, or some president, or some vice president, or some top level management people to understand the system, and also that they designate that certain certain person who is in charge of some export control, or some classification, or some procedure for that export control in each company. So there we are every day discussing with each some private sector, but some problem of private sector is like every 2 years or 5 years the people in charge will change, or some management people will change, and after 5 years, 10 years, they will lose or they may a little bit forget some importance of some export control system. Then they will face some some violation, or some mistakes of some license application procedures. So this kind of some responsibility to clearly specify that the responsibility is very important. And also some other elements is also each element for the audit, or some the training of the company staff, or document document control, and the document the document record is also important. But having such kind of some ICP process, we can have some MITI can have some access to industry, and then the industry can also some they fully understand the benefit of some bulk license, and we can now work together for some common the goal of some export control. So I just skip some of the detail of some ICP requirements. And we are providing some bulk license for the ICP holders, or some other some activities of like streamlining procedure for some ICP holders, or some depend on some the country of destination, or some depend on some end use. So the important thing is that in order to obtain this bulk license, companies certainly should establish their ICP system, and the MITI also conduct on-site inspection to each private company, and then discuss with the company, and they try to confirm whether this company can whether this company is exactly they are some implementing their export control compliance in accordance with ICP. So such kind of some on-site visit, or some individual some conversation, or some every year we are also checking their some compliance activities, and then also we are conducting some inspection to the ICP holders every 3-4 years, or sometimes every year. And then so by giving such kind of attention to each ICP holders, we can keep that our strict export control systems. And then for us, that the challenge is that how to deal with that SMEs or some that the startup companies or some that the academia, because emerging technology is every day it's born or developing in a startup company or some SMEs or some academic or some university or some research laboratory. So, but discussing that there was some approaching such kind of some SMEs is not easy. So we are, MITI is also conducting some 60 export control seminar every year to some targeting some SMEs. And also we are also planning to some expand our activities such as dispatching our people to some SME and they try to establish that some ICP system in the company. Or some that other we also consider planning to some increase the number of some our seminar in each the regional area or some to in cooperation with the Chamber of Commerce or some each industry organization. So these are challenges, but we need to strengthen our activities for the effective export control. So this is the end of my presentation. So thank you for your attention, and also we always welcome your comments for our system or some international export control system. Then we can always try. Then we can some upgrade or some review our system. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Igari. May I now invite Mr. Alexander Lopez from the BIS, U.S. Department of Commerce, USA.
Thank you, Madam Fazia. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I see I have a PowerPoint presentation up, but as I was preparing for this seminar, I'd like to first thank Tracy Patz from my office, who's one of our licensing officers in our Foreign Policy Division, for helping me prepare for this seminar. But I was a little worried because I guess this is my 10th seminar that I've participated in here in Singapore. And typically, I'm giving a number of PowerPoint presentations. And as we worked our way to Singapore, I kept asking, where's my PowerPoint presentation? Where's my PowerPoint presentation? And then I was told I didn't have any. But I realized after the great presentations today by representatives from the Philippine government, the Malaysian government, there's not much else for me to cover. So what I'd like to do is just give you a hodgepodge of things that have been happening with the U.S. export controls over the last year, and some of the things that maybe you can have an opportunity to look forward to over the coming year. As many of you know, with the last administration, we went through quite a big export control reform effort. And one of the things that struck me from one of the earlier presentations was, trying to identify the right balance between national security, export controls, and trade promotion. One of the things I always like to say when I talk about export controls is that export controls is really good for business. And that's illustrated in our relationship with Singapore and exports to Singapore for items that are subject to the Export Administration regulations or the regulations that our Department of Commerce has jurisdiction over. In 2017, there were approximately $30 billion worth of trade, worth of exports from the United States to Singapore. And of those $30 billion by value, only slightly over 1% required a license. Why is that? Well, it's because Singapore has an effective export control system. Typically talk about the 5 pillars of an effective export control system. Many of those pillars have already been discussed. Legislation, a law, a strategic trade act, effective implementing regulations, effective outreach to industry, because without industry, there wouldn't be effective strategic trade. An outreach that highlights internal compliance programs and best practices associated with internal compliance programs. And then finally, effective enforcement. And I think with the presentations that you've seen from the multitude of governments here today, those are the 5 core elements of an effective export control program. So what's been happening in the United States? I mentioned export control reform, $30 billion worth of exports. Well, under our export control reform effort, the Commerce Department typically and historically associated with dual-use exports, exports that have both a military and a civil application. Well, the largest value export to Singapore in 2017 was actually military items, dual-use, military items that were moved over to the commerce jurisdiction during our export control reform effort. So where historically the high volume exports licensed to Singapore were typically those items controlled by the Wassenaar arrangement, those dual use items, both military and civil. Now the largest value licensed export to Singapore are those military items, primarily military parts and components for military aircraft, parts and components for military aircraft engines. So the dynamic has shifted a bit with what we license for export. Why? Well, again, export controls are good for business. Part of the reason we went through the export control reform effort was the flexibilities that are under the Export Administration regulations. With the inflexibilities historically, countries were designing out military export or military parts and components, military items manufactured in the United States because of the stringent licensing requirements associated with our military exports. That doesn't mean they're not licensed by the Commerce Department. They still require a worldwide license. But again, part of that export control reform effort was to put high walls around those things that are critical to our national security, critical to our military, critical to our intelligence gathering, and to promote interoperability with our close allies. And I think that's reflected now in our licensing, particularly as it relates to exports to Singapore. And it's beneficial to our own defense industrial base because of their ability to promote and sell their items offshore. When we talk about export controls, one of the things that I've historically included in my presentations was the fact that our Export Administration Act, or our law, was passed in 1979 and actually expired in 1991 and was renewed annually. Well, finally, our legislature saw fit to finally pass a new Export Control Act this past August. So now we've got a law that's active, that's not expired. But that Export Control Act actually included some things that we're working on rather diligently right now. My colleague from Japan mentioned the issue of emerging technology. You know, when we look at export controls and the multilateral export control regimes and the items that are controlled, oftentimes the question comes up is, gosh, this technology is so old. And typically when you look at the control lists, whether it's the Wassenaar Arrangement, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Australia Group for the chemical and biological dual-use items, we're typically looking in a rearview mirror at items that are yesterday's technology. But we're not looking forward at those technologies that are emerging. What controls are required? Do we control are we looking at the technologies that are coming up, whether in our academia, whether in our government laboratories, whether in some of our military programs. So one of the features of the Export Control Act that was passed in January was to task the Department of Commerce and the other government agencies to get a handle on this issue of emerging technology. We published not a regulation, but a notice of inquiry because, again, industry plays an important role in strategic trade and strategic trade management. But we sent out a notice of inquiry to get public comment to help the U.S. government get a handle on this issue of emerging technology and how should we control this emerging technology. So that's something, well, we're looking forward to addressing that challenge, but I suspect in the coming months we'll be publishing regulations that, as tasked by our Export Control Act, to get a handle on controlling technologies that are emerging. So what are some of the other things to look forward to? Well, I've mentioned the export control reform effort, and for those of you that were familiar with that effort, we actually went through all 21 categories of our U.S. munitions list and went through a comprehensive list review, made our munitions list a little more positive than it was historically, and moved those items that we considered less critical to the jurisdiction of the commerce list. In both our 600 series, you saw that list of different control series in an earlier slide. But we moved those military items to our 600 series in our commerce control list, as well as when we shifted jurisdiction of commercial satellites to the commerce list from the U.S. munitions list, we put those in our new 500 series. But one of the areas that we didn't get to for a variety of different reasons was categories 1 through 3, small arms, big guns, and ammunition. Well, for those of you that do pay attention to rulemaking in the United States, we did go out with a proposed rule, received a number of public comments, and I suspect in early next year we'll come out with a final rule that will move a number of those, again, primarily parts and components for small arms, ammunition, and not so much on the big guns or the larger armaments, but again, something to look forward to in the coming year. I mentioned emerging technology. The other area that the Export Control Act has us focusing on is reaching out to small and medium businesses in the United States, an area in industry that's often overlooked, but certainly has a significant role when it comes to the supply chain and high technology exports. It's kind of interesting that as I was trying to figure out what I was going to say, I kept marking things off as they were already addressed by some of the other and earlier presentations. So forgive me if I feel like I'm going all over the place. One of the areas, though, that we've been working closely with the Singaporean government as we address this area of strategic trade controls is that area of catch-all. If you've paid any attention to the news over the last several years and some of the products that are coming out of Iran, coming out of the North Korea, you'll notice that some of those items that are affect our mutual national security, and some of the items that are manufactured in those countries are manufactured with items that are not on any of the strategic control lists that you'll hear about during the day's discussions. So catch-all becomes a very important aspect of strategic trade controls. And certainly that is a significant factor here in Singapore as a large transit transshipment hub. But certainly you and industry have a significant role in knowing who your customers are, knowing who those end users are, knowing what those end uses are, to help our mutual efforts to address that concern. So, I think that covers it. And I'm looking for Scott Anderson to see if I did speak too long. But with that, I think we'll open it up to either further questions or
Yes.
further discussions.
Thank you, Alex. Before I open the floor, I think I would like to highlight that based on what you have heard just now, there are several developments and updates in the strategic trade control regimes of our presenters in the countries presented here. I just would like to highlight some of these. For example, you will know that countries like Philippines have import controls and extraterritorial applications, and the US as well as have extraterritorial applications and foreign policy controls. And there are also developments in catch-all controls. For example, besides the WMD and military end use, there are also controls to cover terrorism and human rights in software and cyber technology versus human rights, for example, in the EU, which is still in the discussion stage. And the control list updates in many countries, including emerging technologies. And in addition to goods and technology, there are controls on information exchange and provision of services. And for example, in Germany, there is an example provided by Christian on the rating of goods with upgrade potential process in the control list determination. And at the same time, there are also penalties updates in many countries. But in general, to balance regulation and facilitation, countries introduce bulk permits or bulk licenses for companies with robust internal compliance program. And industry outreach to increase awareness is an ongoing process. So now I would like to open the floor. Please take this opportunity to ask questions. This is the only time you have all the 7 countries present here. Okay, may I have first question?
My name is Jack. I have a question on violation penalties in STMA and STA 2010. In the penalties of in STA 2010, the penalties consist of less than 30 million ringgit fine for corporate, less than 10 years imprisonment, and death penalty. Whereas if you look at the STMA, they have only a $250,000 peso. There is actually $4,773 today. The question for the panel is that, would you think that a fine of less than $5,000 is effective in implementing STMA in the Philippines? Thank you.
May I?
Thank you for your question, sir. I just want to be clarified. Is your question fines on the administrative penalties or fines on the criminal penalties?
Help us to elaborate the fines for both, please. Thank you.
Okay. For the administrative penalties, as I have mentioned earlier, there are 3 things that we look into. So it's either fines of 250,000 pesos, or twice the value of the strategic goods or services, or 3 are as assessed by the STMO. So this depends on the kind of violation, the administrative violation that the industry stakeholders will have against the STMA. So there are 3 things or 3 categories. Insofar as criminal penalties, in the Philippines, based on our revised penal code, these are the penalties imposed for these kinds of criminal penalties. Like for prisión correccional or prisión mayor, there are partner fines, penalties imposed, and we cannot, we cannot change that because that's in our basic law. Because criminal laws are jurisdictional in nature, and in the Philippines, that is our law. I hope I answered your question.
Jack, hold on. Here we go. Here you go. Jack, congratulations. You are the winner of the very first question. And just let me jump in real fast on, sometimes just due to the time constraint we're going to have on this, if anybody asks a question and they want to follow up or ask secondary, tertiary questions to that, great opportunity at lunch and the breaks to pull that person aside and have a little more direct questions. Okay. These mics are delayed. Here we go. Stand up, please state your name.
Hi, my name is Manas Tianadi. I have a question for Igari-san regarding the alignment of Japan ECCN, dual use list, to the VASNA arrangement type of ECCNs. Could you help us understand the timeline on when that will happen? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, actually, so we are now in the process of discussion with the legal department and the cabinet, and it may take a few months. But also, Japanese industry require certain period, 1 year, 2 years, for their smooth implementation. So hopefully that within 1 year or 2 years, it will be finalized and then published and for and will be the implemented. So maybe 2 years, but it depends on the discussion between some MITI and also some legal department and the cabinet and also the industry. Yeah, thank you very much.
Next question.
Hello, I'm Sabrina. Yeah, I have a question regarding the export of software and technology. So I understand that these are regulated under the most acts in countries, but the thing is, how do your country monitor export of such software and technology, and how do you know if there are any violations?
I think we'd like to reiterate that in the first place it's a self-compliant company, so make sure they do monitor. Any of our panelists would like to respond to that?
Thank you, Manny, for the question. As rightly mentioned by Madam
May I invite MITI, Mr. Igari, you want to say something? Oh.
For Malaysia, your licenses not licensed, do you have any plans to lengthen the number of years? Currently 3 as well.
Sorry, can you repeat the last statement?
So for Malaysia, currently the bulk license is only valid for 2 years. Are there any plans to make it longer than that?
Okay.
We have received requests from industries, but at the moment we are sticking to 2 years. The reason why is that, as I mentioned earlier, we are small and we have we want to be effective in terms of our evaluation program. So we see the 2-year validity period is reasonable for now. But again, we are receptive over a proposal and a suggestion. I see that I think Japan, it is valid for 3 years. Yeah. But for now, Malaysia would stick to 2 years. Thank you.
Okay, next question for our other panelists.
Sorry, Anthony Gleeson, Senator on Asia. I was really interested in the section about in-field upgrades of equipment or downgrading of equipment. How does the panel as a whole think this will change as time goes on? And are there any strategic groups within, say, Europe or the US that are steering this forward? Because for the industry I work in, that will hold a big impact on the way we do business in the future, as a lot of our systems are sold at the lower cost and upgradable later.
I think if you don't mind, you just repeat the last question that you had.
So it's just really about, was brought up by the presenter from Germany, about in-field upgrades or changing to the status of equipment once it's been sold. For example, the example of the Tesla battery upgrade you gave. I'll give you an example. We sell a system that can be used as a standard heading compass, but could also be upgraded to an INS solution if it has the right components. I was wondering, we mainly comply with European and US regulations on this, but if there are any steering groups or what the panel believes the future will be in this type of market.
Maybe I'll let Kristen.
Yeah, but I can only share like our German perspective. What we just did, it's a very national implementation of how we deal with upgrades. We certainly see this also in the regimes, that this is being discussed intentionally more and more, because it's part of those kind of emerging technology issues we are having. You see in the list that there are certain control interests that aim at certain positions. We might see more of those things in the future. But still, I think it will be more like a national thing on how you control updates and upgrades, and I think it might be good to check with your national authority how they handle that.
Alex, you want to speak?
Yes, I don't have much to add to that, other than, well, there's a couple of factors too. You know, we've all mentioned catch-all. You know, for example, you know, one of the factors to consider there as well is these items are not controlled, but how easily upgraded are they to meet those control parameters? So, you know, catch-all plays an important part in that, and certainly the you know, the issue of upgrades to non-controlled equipment. Certainly, those upgrades would likely be captured as a controlled item, whether it be software or certain mechanical features that are specially designed, if you will, to upgrade those equipments. It's a very difficult problem, and just as my colleague from Germany said, I would check with your national authority.
Thank you. Next question, please. George Tan.
George has one.
I'm George Tan here. I have questions as what's being raised by Igari-san earlier on. Igari-san mentioned that companies, you have your job rotations, change of personnel, so every 2-3 years maybe you changed. And you need sometimes to bring up the next expert in terms of compliance responsibility. How about the countries, the 7 countries, how frequent the officers, the licensing officers being rotated and changed? Because I see many companies has been complaining to me that they have problems dealing with certain country because the new officer come on board, they don't know much about the legislation, and in fact, the industry has to guide and teach them. So I would like to know, the 7 countries in your respective offices, how long the licensing, particularly the licensing officers, will be rotated, or it will be kept for 10-20 years? Because export control is not within 1 or 2 years you can master. It takes a long time, especially experience, in order to understand the details of the importance of this particular legislation. I would like to just ask every country, how do you view this point, and how long the officers will be rotated? Thank you.
Well, no, I think if George doesn't mind, I don't think I would want to ask each and every one of them to explain about their internal guidance or training. You may approach them.
Remember,
I shall
George.
spare our panelists who can answer them separately.
George, you're next, so.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes. Everybody, please, anyone? Later, yeah.
Hi, my name is Jeff. I have a question, more so just for several members, if you can comment. As the EU is discussing, and finalizing their language on how export controls can help, mitigate any abuses of human rights in their legislation, if those were to enter the EU regulations, how would our panel of the Asian nations react? Would the Asian countries also consider legislation or at least wording on human rights?
I think I will let Rick first explain what is the development now. But in terms of how each country would implement, we have yet to see what is the final development of this catch-all, including human rights and all the other considerations. And of course, for example, US has foreign policy considerations as well.
Thank you very much. Well, expecting a similar question already, I reached out to the specialists who are already more than 25 years in the area, George, so in the Netherlands. What I understand from it is that the discussion is currently focusing on what kind of the technologies can lead to violation of human rights and can be used in acts of terrorism. Now, as mentioned, I'm not an expert on that. I see an emphasis more and more in the EU that besides just the, if you allow me to say, the cold regulation and legislation on products, there is much more emphasis on human rights, social factors, and others. And that will be the approach of the EU in the current discussion and future discussions. And well, to be honest, we are looking forward to hear how the rest of the world will look into situations like that as well.
Next question, please. Okay, sorry.
I can also add a bit of this to the discussion. We were asked as technical experts if we can come up with some items that we can put on a list in order to say those are the items that violate human rights and those are the not items that violate human rights. But it's very hard, it's very tough because basically with every item available you can violate human rights. So what we basically did was define a national list basically containing items of category 5 where you can intercept calls and like get to interfere your freedom of speech. But we also will see in the European Union, I think, something like a catch-all control for items that violate human rights. This is pretty much a political question, a political decision, so we won't see much of a control is there.
Could I just add something to
Sure.
Madam Fazia? Under the Commerce Control List, for those of you that are familiar, we do have items that we control for crime control reasons or human rights reasons. One of the things we're looking at now is to upgrade that list to include some new technologies like biometrics and things like that. In addition, as many of you know, our entity list has been expanded since 2008, and we do use the entity list to identify certain end users of human rights concern. So that's another tool that we use besides our human rights controls on our list.
Thank you.
We have one. Good afternoon to all. My name is Agnes. I'm from Renaissance. Just want to clarify one of the presentation slide from Netherlands. There are 5 export control regime mentioned instead of the normal 4 multilateral export control regime.
Sorry?
I saw there's additional ZC.
Let me check my slides. I think I mentioned 5. Maybe there was only 4 in the slide. But
Yeah, I saw there.
I think
mentioned.
just to answer the question, I think the 5th one was the Zanger Committee.
yeah, the Zanger Committee,
which is essentially the nuclear suppliers group.
We should take the normal usual 4 regime. WAWMTCR, AG, and SG. We can disregard the ZC.
the ZC was on one of the slides, so it is absolutely in there. Yeah, there it is.
I think for
Fauzia, so can we?
No, I think I have to explain the part where you're talking about the Zanger Committee. It's mainly relating to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, where countries in this group ensuring that they comply with it's the UN National Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the important ones are the WA, MTCR, NSG, and AG. But having said that, because we adopt our control list based on the EU dual-use list, and of course WAML list, so you don't have to worry about which committees, although it's good for you to understand. You just make sure you understand the individual countries' export control list, because they may also have unilateral lists.
Okay, can noted. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any more questions? Yes?
Can I have my question first? I
Okay,
actually
since
have
you're standing already.
Yeah, okay. I actually have a product that is classified as EAR 99 by, let's say, US, and I have another classification from Europe saying it's also EAR 99. But coming out from Malaysia, they were saying that this is not an EAR 99 product and it is so-called the unlisted. So we supported with documentation from US and EU saying that this is actually EAR 99. So my question to you guys, actually do you work together, let's say from Malaysia, when you have the documents from us, do you actually work with your contacts in US or EU to actually verify that product before telling us or confirming, say we actually need a permit out from Malaysia?
Wait, I think before I pass the mic, can I say something? Okay, essentially, remember, the countries that you are exporting your goods from is very important. So you need to know their laws, their control lists. Because as I said just now, or I think as our panelists have indicated, not all countries have the same standard control list. There are also other considerations. So what you need to do is you understand first in terms of which countries you're dealing with, and then be aware of all the other, understand their control list as well as other controls like the unilateral controls, the extraterritorial, and etc. So I can pass the mic to my EU and US colleagues to explain the EAR 99, and later maybe we can highlight what do countries do once they see such categorization.
Yeah, I understand, but I understand that, let's say like Malaysia, Singapore, or even Philippines now is following the EU list. So I actually don't see the difference whereby, let's say if EU thinks that this is EAR 99, so why does Malaysia or who else thinks that this is not actually a EAR 99 kind of
But
thing?
do we know first what is EAR 99?
Oh, yes.
Okay. It more pertain to whether there's a license exception or license requirements, not so much of whether the control list itself, is regulated or controlled. So there are many considerations. So may I pass the mic to my EU and US?
If I understand the question correctly, it sounds like your question is why might another country classify it differently, and what do we as countries do to clear up those discrepancies? And I can tell you that my office often has discussions with another country where there might be that confusion. And we do try to, when those questions do come up, we do try to either explain or how we came to that conclusion that it was EAR 99. If questions are brought up by industries in those companies with their national authority. So I know for the United States, we do often have discussions with other partner countries that are not members of the regimes to clear up some of those discrepancies, if you will.
Yeah, I think you touch upon a topic that not only can be is applicable for this specific legislation and arrangement. Working in the customs world now for quite a while, I noticed that even HS codes can differ from country to country. But I do agree with Alexander. There are multilateral meetings where topics like this are discussed. My advice to you would be, if you have a specific case, reach out to your national authority and make sure that this specific case is discussed in those groups and in those meetings. And then hopefully, there will be an arrangement to get an agreement on the specification and the listing of your product.
Be assured that we always have these issues also in the regimes as well. The whole export control system basically starts with the control list, and the control list entry, they leave room for interpretation. So one country may read the entry different than another country might, and this happens all the time. And yeah, we try in the regimes to level out, to make it precise, but you basically, with all those goods, it's basically impossible to do so. But we are on a very good contact with other countries on that, and we discuss a lot about that.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I have one example. So in case of some discussion among some export control regime, there are some machine tools which have some measurement, some equipment, and then the measurement equipment is also categorized in another section. So there are some questions whether this item should be controlled in this machine tools or some that there are some measurement systems. So through discussion, we try to avoid some overlap through our discussion in export control regime. Now we divided some that there are some, if it is a machine tools, it should be categorized as machine tools. And then if that, even though it has some measurement, some their function or measurement, some applications. So through this kind of discussion among the export control regime, we try to avoid any misunderstanding or some misinterpretation among us. But if you have any some question or some comments, and we are always happy to some listen and try to consider by some that other partners. Thank you.
Okay. I particularly have nothing more to add. Basically, it has been explained by the panelists. But I would like to reiterate that although Malaysia is using the EU list, but essentially, where licensing is concerned, there are, again, subject to interpretation, and there are many matters to be considered before a product or a commodity is being decided, whether it is controlled, whether it is unlisted. But at the end of the day, industry can always work closely with the authority to understand the matter before even, normally, even before the controller decides, we have a close engagement. And at the STS itself, we do reach out to other agencies, international agencies, for exchange of information and also clarification. That is something that embedded in our work process. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other question?
Sorry. Hi, my name is Jiaxi, and I'm from the semiconductor industry. So my question is really about the emerging e-commerce. I mean, we have been seeing across the region, right, or even intercontinentally, there are trend. I mean, even if we take a look at the latest Alibaba sales on the 11/11 sales days, their revenue and sales volume have been kept growing for like over 10 years. So coming from a so-called omni-channel retailing standpoint, more and more business actually moving from the B2B to B2C, which means that the business would actually require faster clearance, as well as the complexity of dealing with, you know, a whole bunch of individuals, like individual buyers like you and me, or even university students, which actually, again, put on a sort of burden of screening the background of the end user. Of course, all these e-commerce sales, majority are actually year 99 or even uncontrolled products, but in terms of controlled products, they might be put on the shelf anytime, right? So my question is really about the authorities. I mean, coming from your standpoint, do you actually foresee any concerns? Do you have any concerns from your specific country first, in terms of the growing trend of e-commerce, as well as are there anything that you have on mind that potentially could help the industry to do an easier business in terms of e-commerce, as well as staying in compliance with the, you know, all the export control regulations?
Okay, before I pass to the panelists, I think basically the regime in terms of strategic trade control regime applies to all, including e-commerce. I think for some departments or, you know, even the authorities, we would have also approached the service providers, the e-commerce service providers, on the importance of having to comply with the strategic trade control of the respective countries or department. So may I invite maybe my other colleagues if they want to speak on how they control or perhaps advise companies or industry of e-commerce, which are actually the users are general public.
Yes, thank you for your question. That actually we recently have some violation cases that the international student use this international internet auction site, and then he bought some that controlled items and then illegally exported. So this kind of cases happen, and it's increasing challenge for us. So what we are doing, we are actually conducting outreach to some like international internet shopping site or some Amazon or some. Also, we also contacting with the international courier services, because these courier services also that are some transport these items from Japan to foreign countries. So like we are talking to FedEx or some other Japanese the international courier services. So what we can do is try to deepen understanding or some enhance our awareness of these shopping sites, some like Amazon or Yahoo, or some Japanese, or some maybe Alibaba as well, and also that some international courier services or international postal services, try to make them understand. Otherwise, it's not easy for that each individual to make them to understand some of export control system. So we are approaching this international shopping site, internet shopping site, or some international courier service. Yes, thank you very much.
I think in general, e-commerce is one of the biggest burdens customs authorities all over the world are faced with. One of the things that we try to do is to educate our frontline officers more and more. But it's a very big task for them to understand all the different legislations and especially all these specifics for related to dual use, strategic goods, etc. So it will be a big challenge for the future, but it is not something that we can solve by ourselves. So I think that's also why we are sitting in this room together to discuss and reach out to each other. So if you see something that can help us educate our frontline officers, please reach out to us, and then we can set up programs to educate them.
Thank you. Any other question? Maybe the last question?
Yes, my name is Stefanus from Mitsui & Company Asia Pacific. I have a simple question for the Philippines. For the phase implementations of the STMA, in third quarter 2021, you have import. Usually the export control is for export, transit, transshipment, but you have included import here. And as a trader, we expect to have more integrated rules and regulations if you have this export control and then you put import, and how you integrate all this to be easier for the traders to do import and export. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, sir. Actually, insofar as our office is concerned, we cannot do anything about it because that's our legislation. Our legislators have included import, although this is an export control law. That's why I think they called it the Strategic Trade Management Act, not the Export Control Act. And again, to properly implement the law, one of the next steps that we're going to do in the future is to identify which items on the list we're going to subject to import authorizations. So our proposal to our committee actually is that not all items in the list will be subjected to import authorization. So that's one of the steps the government is taking. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we understand that while it is important for traders to know what is the developments in the various strategic trade control countries, there are different types of rules, regulations, and requirements. So it's important that you note these requirements before you proceed with your shipment. Thank you for transaction. Yes, thank you.
Thank you to the panel. So when we sat together, tried to put together this year's program, this was kind of the major component of this program, was to get as many people up on the stage to get you guys the opportunity to ask as many questions as you wanted. Now, I know there's still a lot of questions, so you're still going to have lots of time. Because of that, we're going to kind of readjust our programming for the rest of the afternoon. Yes, we are done for lunch. So we're not going to have any more. Sorry, Teresa. But so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of compress a little bit in this afternoon. Ms. Telesco will go right after lunch for 15-ish minutes. Then we'll go to our next panel. And then later on in the day, we will shorten by 5 minutes depending on the situation. But we have a hard stop at 5 o'clock, so rest not. Or don't be worried. We will be out of here at 5 o'clock, although the hotel will start taking chairs with us still sitting them. But just understand the amazing opportunity we had with these folks up here. Take advantage of it. They're here all day. And I don't know how many law firms we have represented in this room, but this is the opportunity to not have to pay a lawyer to ask a question. Sorry, Janice. But so many times, the larger corporations are working through your inside and outside compliance folks, and it's not a cheap experience to get to these folks. You now have these folks in front of you. Take the time. That's why they're here. That's why Alex flew 26 and a half hours over here. Rick's here. We brought in Dr. Isla from Germany, our folks locally from Singapore Customs, and then a 7-hour flight from Japan, and then the Philippines and Malaysia. We're here. Ask the questions. Take this opportunity. That's why we want to keep this, we want to keep the conversation going. Don't let it stop. Okay, so it is now 12:30. We will start at 1:30. You have 2 opportunities to eat lunch. Well, 2 places. First one is right out the door. Second one, and there'll be some people down towards the escalator helping you get down there. But basically, it's right back underneath this room downstairs on the 2nd floor. The hotel has asked that most of us do that. Go back down to the 2nd floor. Much more space, much more comfortable. In order to increase the size this year from 270-ish to 400, the lunch isn't going to be a 5-star experience. It's going to be some amazing food the hotel's prepared, but it's a standing buffet. So take your time, and I'm gonna say this at the registration table: trade first, Singapore Customs. Wait, let me say it again: trade first. Everybody, stop by the trade first table. Okay, go eat lunch.